Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the Microcredentialing Town Hall. What I said a minute ago was that I was really excited to see over 100 people had registered for this, which says that people are still really interested in this topic, in this concept, in this credentialing product, and where do we go next? And how do we do that right in this space in which we work? Next slide, please. So I want to give just a quick update. I just have a couple slides. I promise I won't slide with you today. We really want to get to the questions because we have a lot of really good ones and want to engage everyone in discussion. We did form a committee 2 years ago to look at microcredentialing. One of the very first things that we did was discuss the terminology and how do we define microcredential or microcredentialing? What does that mean? We engaged as a group. I'm going to share that definition in a minute. And then we took it broadly to the community with a pulse survey. I'm going to highlight a couple of things from that survey, but also let you know where you could find more details about it if you want to deep dive and had not seen that yet. The key takeaways from that survey, if you want that higher level survey, as well as give some summary and background on what the committee was up to, was published in Credentialing Insights. And we do have a link for that article in the slide PDFs. We then also formed working groups. One of the working groups worked on case studies, and we are going to talk a little bit about that today. I think what people are really interested in hearing is what are other groups doing? What does that look like? What worked for them? What didn't work for them? Why did they get started? How does a microcredential fit with their other either educational or credentialing products? We also worked together, another working group, on putting together a toolkit. This is an online resource, and I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. Next slide. So this is the definition that the committee came up with, and the one that we put forth in the pulse survey to say, hey, this is what we came up with. What do you think? Our working definition, we did make a couple of refinements to it after we received feedback from the survey and in further discussion with the group. But we settled on two definitions, one a noun and one a verb, which you can see here on the slide and will be in the handout. Next slide. So that pulse survey that I mentioned, it did go out in early 2020. We had 214 responses, which is good for a survey in this space. So we had a lot of, like today, a lot of active participation and engagement. You can see sort of the breakdown there. There's a lot more details on the data that we gathered in that pulse survey, which is available online. Overwhelmingly, people agreed with our proposed definition, 88%. But we didn't stop there. We punched into, like, if people disagreed, what was their issue? What question or concern did they have about the definition we were putting forward? Two of the sort of themes that rose to the top is that the definition is too restrictive. There's been discussion all along the way that trying to create standards or accreditation pathways for microcredentials might stifle innovation, and maybe that person was worried about that, or those folks. Also recognizing that credentials are on a continuum, and how do you really define what the scope of one was? And I think we all still wrestle with that. Next slide. Most organizations that respond, or most folks that responded, 71% said that their organizations were not currently offering microcredentials. I'd love to repeat this survey now and see if in the world we're in today, if I think you'll see more people are doing microcredentials. We're seeing dramatic shifts, I know, in adult learning and training around people wanting certifications, wanting to upskill and wanting recognition for that, and wanting to do that in a relatively short amount of time. Microcredentials kind of seem attractive in that context. Next slide. I pulled out this one piece of data that came out of that survey, and that is what organizations are thinking or planning. Some sort of stackable program. You often hear stackable credentials or stackable microcredentials that stack together to form a credential. People were thinking about or considering those. recognition of a single skill or competency, which is that goes to the scope of it. Maybe an ABC or assessment-based certificate program, a little bit less hybrid programs, lower on certification, and then education and training or certificate program without an assessment. So that could be similar to an assessment-based certificate program, but not one that's accredited or bound for accreditation. Next slide, please. We recognized a couple of opportunities and challenges for developing microcredentials. In terms of supporting factors, stakeholder and board member interests, this is certainly something that's on everybody's tongue. They're asking for, they've heard it and they're interested and want to hear more, or maybe are saying, hey, we want you guys to work on this and create microcredentials or look at what that would look like for our organization. Also considering new learners and millennials, they are looking for faster track skill recognition and building and knowledge building, addressing a need that's in the industry. Some obstacles on sort of the flip side of that. How do you integrate a microcredential into that organization's larger strategic goal? How does that fit within educational and credential products or offerings that you have? If there's no accreditation or standard pathway for it, would they be recognized? What would it take to have them be recognized? And then no clear guidelines or best practices, although we do hear and heard in the Pulse survey, folks aren't so sure that they want yet another accreditation pathway. Next slide. So what things can I.C.E. as an organization do to or what can they provide to members in the profession? We did look at that in the committee. We saw it as it was our charge to help come up with a definition that included scope of microcredentials, set some clear delineations or definitions between these different types of programs, between a certification or ABC, perhaps developing best practice guidelines, developing case studies. A number of the things that are on this list we have built or output as a committee. I want to talk to you for a few more moments just about that, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Next slide. So I mentioned that one of the things that we did as a committee was to create this a microcredentialing toolkit. This is an online resource on the I.C.E. website. If you go to resources and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you will find microcredentialing toolkit. We have that link directly to it in the slides in the handout. I think we're going to also put it in the chat, as well as a link to where you can download that PDF on that Pulse survey I was talking about. There's a number of things in here that might be helpful to you if you're thinking of creating microcredentials, or even if you're already in the process. We took time to try to define and look at things to consider at different phases of development. The case study group also developed a really rich set of case studies that you can read and watch in video. I think that can be extraordinarily helpful to hear how other organizations structured it and what they're already doing. And how did that go for them? And then we also list in that toolkit some additional resources all on this topic. So it's all in one place on the I.C.E. website. And I think we have one more slide. All right, that's it. So there is a link, I believe, in the second slide to that Pulse survey article, as well as a link to the toolkit. But for the remainder of our time together, I want to open it up to discussion. We had a number of questions that were sent in advance. So is there anybody who would like to start out raising their hand, or I can go to one of the questions that we received in advance? I'll give it 1 minute. Not even a minute, maybe a second.
Well, Michelle, we had a question in the chat from Rebecca. Are there any differences in practices between accredited programs and non-accredited programs?
I'm trying to find the question. As far as microcredentials go, so if it's an accredited microcredential versus a non-accredited microcredential?
I can jump in and then somebody else can definitely go for it. With our organization, I'm with Intelios, and I oversee the POCA Certification Academy, which is a micro-credential program. We just followed best practices. Though our micro-credential program is not accredited, we wanted to make sure that we followed best practices when we were developing the program. So yes, if your program's not accredited, it might allow for more flexibility and to utilize some innovative approaches. But I would recommend anyone who's developing something just to make sure you're following best practices, just in case you're looking to get accreditation in the future.
I can chime in as well. This is Jennifer Naughton. I'm a member of the actually not a subcommittee, but the committee, the micro-credentialing committee. And so just to take a step back and be clear, there is no accreditation for micro-credentials. What there is there's accreditation for certification and assessment-based certificates. So what you would, if you're seeking accreditation, then what you would want to do is you would want to accredit the parts of your program depending on which category it or they fall into, as kind of individual elements, as opposed to trying to accredit the whole string of credentials, if you will, of micro credentials. So if you have certifications, you would go through the certification accreditation route, and if you have assessment-based certificate programs in there that are micro credentials, you would go that route.
I certainly think you could have an assessment-based certificate program that was accredited or non-accredited. And either way, that certificate could be considered a micro-credential if that's how you define it to your audience. And I think even if you're not accrediting, I agree, if you follow the accreditation standards, especially like in the assessment-based certificate program, that standard 5 and standard 6, those are best practices for running a really good program in terms of design and the test and administration of the program. So you can follow those as a guideline or a best practice, but not go all the way to accreditation. I want to pivot to a question that we received in advance that I also think will be of interest to the whole group. One of the questions, and I'm going to punt to my co-committee member, Jim, are there any specialty nursing certifications doing micro-credentialing? And if so, what specialty are they in? So I'm going to punt to Jim to talk about their experience.
So this is Jim. I'm with the certification board for perioperative nurses. Nurses that work in the operating room. So the one group that I can tell you that is working in this is CCI. We have a number of micro credentials. Some of them are standalone, some are stackable. Some lead to a certificate of mastery in a perioperative related subject, and at least one of those stacks up to a credential called CFPN. So the short answer is there are some nursing credentialing groups working here. I know the certification board for emergency nurses is also working with digital badges. So there is some work. I think CCI may be among the groups that's doing the most here. Certificates of mastery, digital badges, micro credentials, and certifications. We have connected all of those with our current programs.
Thanks, Jim. I have another question here that I wanted to go back to Jasmine. Jasmine, you started to touch on this a little bit, but one of the questions that we received that I think is a really good one is, can micro credentials be stacked?
Well, again, we do stack them. Our micro credentials can stand alone. In theory, if you just wanted to work on a micro credential in strategic planning, you could. You could also stack that up as part of earning a certificate of mastery, earning a credential. We've set them up that way. we consider micro-credentials in some ways to be modular building blocks that can be stacked up in a diversity of ways. That's our approach. The nice thing about this very early stage of using micro-credentials, they're very flexible at this point, and you can do a lot of things with them.
And I would agree with what Jim was saying. I've seen some organizations, they do a stackable model where they have a full traditional certification and micro-credential is used as an add-on. Maybe it's an industry where technology is changing very quickly. And so whatever the new technology or approaches, they'll add a micro-credential onto their full certification. With our organization, with our micro-credential program, it's stackable from the very beginning. So an individual can choose to acquire a micro-credential in a specific area. So we're dealing with healthcare professionals. So they may choose to get a micro-credential in cardiac point of care ultrasound. And then other clinicians may choose to stack a cardiac, a lung, a abdominal trauma, the different content areas to get an emergency medicine certification. So our organization is doing it that way, where you can stack the limited scope micro-credentials into a full-fledged certification. However, I've seen them other ways where they're used as an add-on versus taking the individuals and stacking them up into a certification.
I have a follow-up question to that. So we have a certification program for security professionals specializing in cybersecurity, and we'd like to do some micro-credentialing on specific systems. And so does it really matter, I guess if they obtain a designation, those letters behind their name, whether the micro-credential results in a certificate of mastery, or would it be best practice to say, I.C.E plus on-guard system plus this system, like as an add-on to the specializations that they've, mastered with those micro-credentials?
That's definitely a good question. And I think maybe a question for the larger group as well is, should the micro-credentials modify any of those designations? At our organization, we haven't really had them impact any designations that have been awarded. It's just something else that they're able to show to demonstrate their proficiency in this additional area. But it doesn't, at this time, it doesn't affect their designations, but I'd like to open it up to the others and if they have any examples or ideas on that.
Anyone want to unmute? Any brave folks? All right. There was a question that came in the chat that is somewhat similar to a question that we received in advance about JTAs. And it's the question of how are you defining what and how competencies in each micro-credential are equivalent to eligibility requirements and or examination outlines or some other structure. And we also received a question that I think is somewhat similar, and that is, does a micro-credential require a JTA or job task analysis? Jennifer, you were going to speak a little bit to that.
Sure, happy to do that. So the question related to whether or not a micro-credential requires a job task analysis is the classic, it depends. It depends a bit on the stakes. It depends, sorry about the sirens in the background. Perfect timing. So it depends on the stakes. It depends on what the micro-credential, if it's a designation or not, and what it might represent. Is it based on validation of practice and so on and so forth? So I'll give an example, and Michelle, I think this is one that you've thrown out before, is that if you have a micro-credential that's an assessment-based certificate that's, for instance, about onboarding. It's a training program with a little test about onboarding. That is something that requires a thorough needs assessment, but not necessarily a JTA, since you're not really defining practice. Whereas if you're looking at something that Jim might be in charge of, where you're looking at a micro-credential that relates to a medical field and it's part of a designation path, that would definitely require a JTA, just like any other credential would require a JTA. So it's kind of important to know what the stakes are and whether or not you're looking at defining practice. But I will point out, even if you have an assessment-based certificate, that you're going to want to be thinking, if you're not going to do a JTA, you definitely want to be thinking about a thorough needs assessment. If you're doing a sizable scope of, if your micro-credential is of some scope. So hopefully that helped. I guess kind of the simplest answer is, if you would ordinarily do a JTA for the technical work, then you would continue to do a JTA. If you don't ordinarily do a JTA and you might do a needs assessment, then you would default towards the needs assessment. Great question.
Anybody have any experience with micro-credentials that required a JTA? Or think that a JTA, even if it's not required, think that a JTA might serve that, the development of that micro-credential well?
Michelle, we made a decision early on at CCI that we would always use JTA findings. So earlier I said you could do a micro-credential documented with a digital badge in strategic management. That is one of the 7 major areas that's covered under our management credential. But we started with that and said this segment of knowledge is already defined in the JTA. And for the sake of a micro-credential, we want to address one specific area. This is well defined. And so we used job analysis findings and said, for this, essentially 1/7 of the material covered under the certification exam, we're going to cover with a micro-credential. And that's how we approached it. We've never wavered. We've done micro-credentials where we worked with other credentialing bodies. The other group that's working in here in nursing is called the Association of Nurses in Professional Development, AMPD. We partnered with them. They shared portions of their role delineation studies so that we could work together to build up other micro-credentials, certificates of mastery. But we always based it there because we were in the mindset of being accredited and realized the importance of JTAs. So we just always worked from there.
Makes perfect sense. Lenora, did you have a question or comment you'd like to add?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on some of what Jennifer was saying and maybe take a little turn off that path, in that what the micro-credential represents, I think, dictates what whether you need a JTA or not. If we all agree that there's a new diagnostic test that every one of our professionals should be aware of and know how to utilize, we don't need a JTA for that. That's really overkill. What we do need is something more like, as Jennifer was saying, and maybe it doesn't compute to people when we say needs assessment, because in learning it means something slightly different, where you are going to the stakeholders and saying, okay, we all agree that the diagnostic test is needed. What specific knowledge is needed? What specifically do professionals in our discipline need to know about this diagnostic test?
And then basing that program on the need.
Right.
Indeed. I'm going to scroll the chat for another question.
Michelle, I do have to sign
Yeah.
off. I would
Okay,
just like to say, if anybody would like to contact me, I'd be glad to talk more about what we're doing. I will point out, you've got a whole bunch of expertise here. I'm going to just unabashedly say I admire Jasmine's program. I'm a fanboy. I think she does some of the best in the industry. And from my perspective, if anything we've done can help you, digital badges, micro credentials, glad to share. And let me know. And before I leave, I'll just put my email in the chat box. But I did put a link to our one stackable credential.
thanks, Jim. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your email. I think that's really generous of you. I'd also call out that Jim was on the working group that put together the case studies, which are in the toolkit that I mentioned, and the link is in the slides for this presentation. So I would encourage folks to use that and access that if that would be of help to you. I had another question that I wanted to go to Mr. Bill West for, and that was someone had asked in advance that or shared that they were interested in knowing how the Credential as You Go group might impact standards and accreditation, and specifically for microcredentials.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Share your insights on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump on that. So the Credentialing as You Go initiative, it's actually a very exciting initiative, and I.C.E. has a podcast coming out this month that I would encourage everybody to listen to. I'm moderating, so this is a bit of a self plug, and I guess that's why I got the question. But it's with two of the leaders in that initiative, two of the founders and leaders of that, Nan Travers and Holly Zanville. Really interesting. Something I think this whole entire community should get on board with. It's really based on, there's a large dropout rate, people not making it all the way to a full BA or BS, and an initiative funded initially by the Lumina Foundation of creating micro-credentials, kind of assessments, small achievements along the way to get them in the system and get them something that's employable, something that's encouraging along the way to keep them on their education path and then beyond. So it's really more of a framework and an initiative. And within that, as people are developing micro-credentials, encouraging them onto full-blown industry certifications, either during the academic career or beyond, there's definitely a focus on meeting standards of that industry, right? NCCA to us, there's some others within that. So it's not really, the framework doesn't say here are the standards for each individual one, but as people, as associations jump on board to create these achievements as they go, are really, they tout and encourage standards to be followed within those credentials. So, and I'll put in the chat right now a link to the CAYG Credential as You Go initiative, and definitely encourage something. This is a great way for everybody on this call to get deeper into academia for your profession and create a more lifelong relationship, kind of to help people achieve as they go. So I don't know if that really answered it, but there's not a direct answer to that question, but we'll encourage everybody to check it out.
Any follow-up questions? Thank you, Bill. For Bill on that. I see a question that, thank you, Bill, that came in the chat saying from Andrew, websites indicate that micro-credentials are typically tied to a course of study with subsequent demonstration of a knowledge, skill, or ability. That would be a certificate program. I would agree with that. I come out of the training space. Not a certification, because there's education or training involved. And can a micro-credential be either model or maybe another model? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, could it be a certification? Yes. Could it be a assessment-based certificate program that's accredited? I mean, my answer to that question is yes. There's no micro-credential standard, but if you're going to align or develop your micro-credential program to existing accreditation standards, then then that is what would trigger what's needed for that particular program. It might not be, as Lenore was saying, large enough that you need to, it's an entire scope of practice, and so that requires a JTA, or even there's a specific skill or competency you want to explore. So, okay. Anybody else have any questions? I'm going to scan the chat. Does anybody agree or disagree that a microcredential could be a certification? Or could you stack 3 microcredentials to earn a certification? Is that something that would be possible?
And that's what we do in our program. We do stack it. I feel like the microcredential can really be any model. It's going back to the definition. It's really just that scope. It's a more limited scope. So anything that you can do in a traditional credential education program, you can do the same thing in a microcredential. It's just limited scope of what the focus of the content of the microcredential is on.
And what's needed in the community. I think that's a big piece of it too.
Stephen, I see your hands raised. Do you want to unmute and contribute?
Yeah, based on a prior question, the JTA needs assessment and how it compares to learning objectives for a learning environment rather than a credentialing proper environment. How do those compare and contrast with regard to a microcredential if it's issued as the culmination of a learning environment?
So if a microcredential, I'll take the learning piece of it, includes learning or some sort of education or training, and it's a microcredential, then typically what's required for that, or what's the best practice, even if you're not accrediting, is to conduct a needs analysis or needs assessment. And it's during that process where we look at things like what is needed in the marketplace, what learning outcomes are we trying to drive to, and having subject matter experts involved in validating and defining quite specifically what the need is for that program. So we might have an idea what the need is. We often find out different things after we've conducted that needs assessment. And then once we have that, basing the program on the NA, I do work with certificate programs that had or started with a JTA instead of a needs analysis. That's a little bit different pathway. Oftentimes the task statements, you can't directly lift a task statement often and make it into a learning objective, right? It has to pass through a kind of an educational filter, but it is absolutely possible to use a JTA, use the competencies and the knowledge and task statements that came out of that as a way to develop content that's validated, that this is in fact what people need to know and be able to do to demonstrate this particular competency. And so whether you're doing a needs analysis or a JTA, following those best practices to come out with, to validate what you need to build before you build it. It's very difficult to go, and I talk about this all the time. People that come to us with certificate programs, they've already developed, maybe they didn't do a needs analysis. It's very difficult to reverse engineer that. I think everyone who's on the call today can appreciate that on the certification side. If someone came to you and said, we already have a certification, but we didn't do a JTA, what would you say? Whoops, right? It's the same thing on the certificate side. If you haven't done a needs analysis, if you don't have a subject matter expert guided needs analysis to validate what your learning outcomes are, and also then even sometimes the design of your program, then you're flying blind. You don't know exactly what the needs are.
So what I'm hearing is, in the context of this discussion, a needs analysis and learning outcome development are paired together, just like a JTA would be for a certification program. That was the connection I was wanting to secure in my mind. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I usually come out of the needs analysis gate with a program blueprint, and that may or may not be aligned to JTA validated competencies, but it is often knowledge domains or competency domains. The learning objectives, an outline how we're going to teach this content, delivery modality, all of that. And then more details around that in a design document. And then that is what we use to guide development of the education and training. And could that type of program be a micro-credential? You bet, absolutely.
Yeah, there's this is Jennifer. I'll piggyback and say there's usually the development of learning objectives and then some type of proficiency level that's collected so that you know to what extent somebody needs to demonstrate or to perform based on the learning objective. So yeah, the bottom line is there's additional information that is collected, or different information that's collected with the training side versus the certification side.
Right.
So, Michelle, you and I should do a webcast on that. That'll be an interesting one.
Just on that topic alone,
Yep.
for sure. Lenora, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wonder if we could shift the focus from the mechanics to why micro-credentials have appeared and why they're so popular. There's a lot of staying power here. And we're never going to agree on exactly what one is. Higher education is defining them differently. People in different parts of the world are defining them differently, and focus instead on the value that they bring, the benefit that they bring that is different from the credentials that we already have. One of which being is, and where they all came from originally, was because traditional credentials did not meet all needs. Academic degrees and certifications didn't meet all needs. And we want to have a tool where we can recognize the acquisition of knowledge and skills along the way, rather than having to wait for the big moment, or not be able to have what happens after the big moment of the degree or the certification is gone. And truly, if we're trying to encourage people to engage in, we don't have to encourage them, they do it anyway, lifelong learning, then why aren't we recognizing people for that? And the flexibility that the micro-credential offers, and being able to do that and giving people something to demonstrate to employers or to patients or to others, the other knowledge and skills that they have. And I feel like when we lose sight of that, we try and go down these paths of making it look like a certification or look like an assessment-based certificate program. It doesn't have to look like any of those things. It looks like what is needed to fulfill the objective of recognizing and in some cases providing the knowledge or the training for a particular skill set or a knowledge. My personal opinion on that.
So it could be something as simple as 90-minute e-learning, for example. Like people need to learn a very specific skill or piece of knowledge. I'm thinking of one that we did during the pandemic, where a certain type of allied health professional suddenly were doing all of their appointments in primary care on telehealth. And they needed to be trained very quickly on telehealth. So they weren't, out there, looking for a certification or looking for an assessment-based certificate program. They were looking for, how can I learn telehealth quickly? What does it look like to room a patient in a telehealth appointment? What am I charting? Very tactical, very practical, very close. Like I used to say when I worked in corporate training, close to task, right? They're living this every day. It's new to them. They don't want this. They're not going to go back to school. There's nowhere for them to go to study it. And so an association was able to develop a very discrete 3-module e-learning course with a, that had an assessment at the end. It was assessment based. Piece that might be a monograph or a short e-learning. It was meatier than that, but it wasn't as large as some of the certificate programs that they offered. It was as large as it needed to be, which is a beautiful thing. So we went at it from the angle of, okay, who are these learners? What are they doing? And what do they need to know to be able to pivot very quickly in their practice? And I think that they're not calling it a micro-credential, but it could be. I think about things like that being micro-credentials too.
And I think the other thing in regards to the point you made of the why of the micro-credential with our organization, one of our motivations was for accessibility. Our micro-credential is offered globally, and based on our delivery method, we're able to offer it all over the world, and they are able to get that same quality of learning, of demonstrating their proficiency as anyone who can go into a brick and mortar. And so that was one of our motivations as well for a micro-credential.
Because this originally came from a place of relying only on certifications and academic degrees are preventing a large portion of the population from having their knowledge and skills recognized. And it came from a place of equity and inclusion originally.
I think perhaps the wrong way to drive the bus, if I can be contrary for just a minute, is to go at it from a perspective of we need micro-credentials. As just everybody else has them. It's the flavor of the week if we want to compete. You might find that micro-credentials are indeed a good fit for the organization, but I think if you're starting from a place of, just wanting to get micro-credentials just for the sake of having them, or because you think that that's what you should be doing, you should slow down, stop, and validate that. So I would put that stake in the ground. Anybody agree or disagree with that?
I would definitely, oh, go ahead.
Maybe that's because we come from the certification world. If we came from fields where there weren't certification, maybe we would feel differently about that.
Possible.
But I would definitely say, like, don't just create a micro-credential just to know your audience. One of the lessons learned, I would say that we would do is to get buy-in. We're in a healthcare profession, and just the term micro-credential made them feel that it was something that was lesser, and it's not. It was just a limited, something that was more limited in scope. So know your audience. You may have to do if your organization feels that micro-credentials are a good fit, you may have to go through the process of getting buy-in from your audience before you develop it, because just that term with us, we had some hurdles that we had to overcome before we really got buy-in from our healthcare community on micro-credentials.
Jasmine, this is Jennifer. I think you're raising an excellent point, that sort of relates to where do you start? And I think it also depends. I mean, I've heard in some responses to that have been start with your core, start with the things that change rapidly. But I'm of the mind that if you have a population such as medical, where they're deeply ingrained in the core being validated through massive exams, very rigorous exams, you might not want to start there. You might want to start in an area where it's either an elective or in a brand new area where you're not transitioning something that's already a legacy exam or test or, very large scope. You may want to start on something that's new and a little bit lower stakes just for the change management aspect of it to get people comfortable with it. But I think the change management piece is huge, and who your audience is and whether or not they're going to, what their perceptions are of a micro-credential and whether or not there's going to be acceptance. That really is a very important factor, not just technical ones in terms of where do you start.
But are we thinking from our established age viewpoint about what these credentials look like and what people want? And from the own bubbles, our own bubbles that we live in the credentialing world, as to what people want or need, how are employers going to get their people upskilled if they have to send them back to school to earn the degree that's needed to get the certification, which is the only official credential that's out there.
I think
As
the-
you could tell, I'm playing devil's advocate today.
No, I think the point is well taken. I don't see it as a binary. I see it actually as you really have to look at your stakeholders and your stakeholder base, especially if you're trying to retrofit something or retro engineer something.
Yeah.
Because if you don't understand maybe the perceptions or misconceptions or where your, or points of resistance, if you don't factor that in to the overall plan, then that could end up sabotaging the program. So I think your point is a very good one, Lenora. I think my point is just really know your stakeholders, know your audience. If your stakeholders and your audience are, let's say, not entrenched in a certification model and they're, you know, they're looking at it more from a kind of a fresh perspective, then you don't have to necessarily worry about the resistance that you may encounter. And then
Right.
that's not a component of the whatever.
Yeah,
your
and
implementation
I
plan is.
wouldn't say you don't have to worry about it. Anybody that's tried to make modifications to their existing credentials knows that there's always immediate resistance. It's a question of when do you do what is going to be right for the future going forward, and then handling the resistance as opposed to potentially facing resistance and then backing off immediately, and then your credential becomes like a dinosaur. So it's but that's perhaps getting off the micro-credential path. that pertains to many changes that we make in certification. I like to say it's just easiest to best to rip the Band-Aid off. It's like ripping a Band-Aid off. There's a lot of fuss in the beginning, and eventually you'll be okay.
I think the key themes here would be just know your audience. And if you're going to run into resistance, make sure that you build that into your communication and change management plan. So to your point, Lenora, you know, resistance changes change and resistance, you'll see it, but you need to at least understand it's out there, understand the perspectives, and then also really don't underestimate the change management communications plan that you may have to build in order to overcome that resistance. But to your point, I mean, it's not, resistance is no reason to say, well, we're not going to do it. A resistance is just something that you have to handle and handle effectively by knowing your audience and also making sure that you're building a robust change management plan before you roll out the program. Do it early. So that would probably be my, you know, another question that came up. I think it was in the questions that were submitted in advance is what are the lessons learned and what would your recommendations be? And there you go, there's mine. Mine is if you're, you know your audience, know the points of resistance. And also if you're going to, if you know that you have a highly resistant audience, make sure that you're thinking about that upfront as before you're even designing the program, as opposed to an afterthought. So that would be my recommendation.
I would agree with that, and really thinking at the beginning, at the genesis of the discussions about what is needed, determining what process we're going to follow to find out what's needed. You know, looking at it from a needs analysis, but also a business need too. It's going to cost money to build these programs. Are they going to satisfy a need? Is there an expectation we're going to make a return on that investment or not? That's not always the goal, but sometimes it is. And so what does that look like? So oftentimes I find in the needs analysis process, we're looking at the strategic side of this as much as the design of that program, because those programs rarely exist in a vacuum. They're usually being developed and added to other existing legacy programs that are available. And they could be certifications, assessment-based certificate programs, just regular CEUs, that type of thing. So I always harp on the needs analysis. It's big.
I think
Can't-
that we lost Michelle. Oh, we lost you for a second,
Are
Michelle.
you there back, Michelle?
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. So there
So
keep
it
in the
looks
chat, but I think it's a good one, are how are microcredentials understood in the marketplace? So like, do employees or people that are in the job market or employers, do they know what a microcredential is? Do they want that? Are they looking for it in their job candidates? Is there anybody who's joined us today that can share some experience around that? Or you surveyed your membership or folks in your stakeholder group and they're saying, yes, we want microcredentials and this is what it means to us. Anybody getting a temperature read on that in their space they want to share?
For us, we have definitely found a large interest. Again, our microcredential is for healthcare professionals, for individuals who were like trying to go into residency. So they finished medical school, they're going to residency. And so they found that it was kind of that resume booster. Again, we're finding that the microcredentials seem to resonate with the younger audience, just in regards to small bits, learning as they go, being able to demonstrate that proficiency as they go versus waiting all at one time. So though we don't have employers specifically looking for it, we see that the students, the candidates are looking for that because they feel that it's adding value. It's just differentiating them from others. The other thing that we are also seeing a trend with our microcredentials, again, being in the healthcare profession, a lot of times hospitals are having to develop their own internal credentialing programs, and they're using our microcredential to help augment their internal credentialing program versus developing one internally themselves.
Interesting. Anybody else? One of the questions that comes up often when we do panel discussions on this topic is around differentiating microcredentials from digital badges. We literally get that question. So I'm going to read this question that we got. Do you differentiate between microcredentials and digital badges? So there's clearly, I think, still confusion or thinking around the relationship between a digital badge and a microcredential, and is a digital badge a microcredential? I mean, I think there's some people that might think that. I mean, my opinion on that is a digital badge is just that digital recognition that you achieved or earned something. In that instance, it could be a microcredential, it could be a certification, it could be that you attended and participated in a conference. You can, I think everybody knows, you can digital badge for lots of different types of activities. And I would say microcredential is one, but it doesn't mean that a microcredential is a digital badge and digital badge is a microcredential. Anybody have any thoughts on that topic or experience with digital badging for microcredentials?
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm Michelle. It's good to see you again. We have a stackable course where it's microcredentials, and we've had one that's been accredited by I.C.E, which is exciting, and we're submitting for the other 6 microcredentials. But we do have a digital badge and the microcredential distinction, and it's an assessment-based certificate program. And unlike Jasmine, it's interesting because we have the scope of our audience runs from healthcare to marketing to public health. And so we've had some questions about what is a microcredential, what is a digital badge. And a lot of folks who take the microcredential are assuming they're going to get letters after their name because they see the word credential. And so I can't stress enough how important the communication aspect of that is, of what is a digital badge, what is a microcredential when you're marketing the program. For our participants, they want a way to, like you were saying, Michelle, to display that they completed this, and they really don't want to display their resume on LinkedIn or on their socials. So we use it as a way for them to display that they've completed this. And then when they obviously apply for jobs and send their CV or their resume, they list it on their resume. But for them, it's a way for them to distinguish themselves from others that, hey, I completed this. And we also host a variety of conferences, and we'll really encourage those folks to include their digital badge in their badge it's a virtual conference and their virtual conference badge. And so I agree, Michelle, it's just a way for them to display to everyone on their social and LinkedIn that they've completed this micro credential rather than posting their resume.
I think I'm back.
Yep, I hear you now, Michelle.
Okay, I froze for just a second. I must be having some connectivity issues today. That never happens, right? Rachel, one quick follow-up question on, I know you have multiple micro-credentials and your digital badging. Would you offer a different digital badge for each micro-credential? And then when they stack up, yet a different badge for people who stack to that level? What is that your structure for your digital badging?
Yes, so we have seven micro credentials with different topics, and there's a separate logo for each one. It's all under health literacy specialist, and so they can get a digital badge in ethics, a digital badge in communication. If they complete all seven, the digital badge is the health literacy specialist digital badge, meaning they've completed all 7 micro credentials. And same thing, they get a certificate of completion. And each certificate, again, has a different logo for each micro credential, and they complete all 7, they get the certificate of completion as a health literacy specialist. So yes, we do distinguish between all 7.
Interesting. We are almost out of time. Are there any last minute thoughts or questions?
All right,
Well, thank everybody for joining us today and engaging in a conversation with us. We appreciate you coming. We hope you do access the resources that I mentioned at the beginning of the town hall. And feel free to reach out to any of us, any panelists, if you have follow-up questions or I.C.E. We're here to support you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for facilitating and everyone for participating. Again, we'll let you know when the recording's available, and we'll also save the chat and see what questions you have and maybe additional resources we can pass your way. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.